Hey everyone, thank you for joining us today for this video series. Today we're going to be talking about understanding vendor maturity and service offerings with our guest, Wes Spencer. Wes, introduce yourself because if I think if anybody doesn't know you, now's a prime opportunity for them to get to know you.
Yeah. Hey, Roddy. What's up, my brother? It's good to be with you. Thanks for having me. I'm Wes. I'm a security nerd. I also, I'm going to say it this way. I'm a recovering bankster. I actually did a ton of what we're going to talk about today for my bank. I haven't done this in years, but it's definitely something I have bled through and love talking about this topic. I'm also the co-founder of Empath. We are a company helping MSPs find true north in all of their employee growth. And I'm really glad to be with you today.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah, glad to have you. I joking about people not knowing you because when I went to do this video series, I was like, all right, of all the people I'm talking to, who has the most LinkedIn followers? And like you trumped everyone by like a magnitude of people. So
It's funny. I
um
don't even know how it happens. I just, I think if you just post and help people, like like that's just an offshoot versus people like, how do I game the system? I'm like, I don't know how you game the system. Just
yeah. Yeah. All right, first question. Food related question. So you're stuck on a desert island and can only have one food for a year. Uh what food do you pick and why?
is it made the way I want it? That's my
Yes,
own.
yes. You
Oh
wave a magic wand, you can have whatever food you want.
man, how do you go wrong with a nice Texas brisket? Uh, Smoked by Aaron Franklin himself. I mean, if I had that, like I could just die on the first day and I'd be happy. So like it doesn't matter what happens, whether it's in there for the rest of my life or a day. Every day is a wonderful day.
I mean, I'm pretty sure if people figure out you have brisket every day, a line will form. Like
Right?
it's just like, you'll be rescued in within a day or two. Right.
Exactly.
Awesome, awesome. All right, so let's talk a little bit about vendor maturity, right? That
Sure.
you gets thrown around a lot of like, how do we practice vendor maturity or vendor risk management? How do we gauge how mature our vendors are? So like let's start off with like from your perspective, what is vendor maturity and how does gauging impact or gauging maturity impact services offered? Right.
It's a tricky question, right? Because on one hand, you have these long-term stalwart vendors that have these things we call trust centers with all this documentation and data. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have a vendor that started yesterday and has their very first MSP that they're working with, right? And so you have a pretty big spectrum. And one thing I would say is age of the vendor does not equal maturity. And I'd also say the number of documents that you can shove at someone's face does not also equal maturity, right? So I would sort of define this idea of vendor maturity as maybe if we're thinking from a cyber lens, I'd be thinking, what are the things we're doing to safeguard the data that we store, process, or transmit? That's kind of where I would say is home base. Now, if we're talking about other areas of maturity, maybe it's financial maturity, maybe it's maturity of the actual leadership team and their vision, things like that. The number of years that go into it definitely play a pretty big factor, right? But if we're talking from the cyber perspective, I would just say, what are the things that they're doing to adequately protect and safehold the information that they store, process, or transmit for us?
Yeah, I like your first analogy where you're like age of business because like age doesn't equal wisdom, and in some points we see that like I hate to use the term tech debt, but like that comes into play, right? We see various vendors out there who have been around for decades with legacy codes still, varying degrees of poor practices. They're just from years and years and years of just not taking the resources needed, I guess, to refactor code or redo their code
Right.
base. So
Right.
how?
I won't name a
Yeah,
name, but
yeah,
I know a vendor that still to this day stores their customers' usernames and passwords in clear text tickets. It's
yeah.
horrifying. But they're a very well-known vendor that's been in the space for a long time. So yeah, that goes to our point of it doesn't your age and size and number of dollars you put and the salary of your CISO does not equal good security necessarily or good maturity.
Yeah, and I think that's part of it. So like let's focus. So we have kind of a definition now, right? What is it? What is maturity? I think we've muddied the waters more than we've cleared it on what maturity is. But so I'm an MSP, right? And I'm starting to work my way through my vendors, and I'm saying to myself, okay, how do I know they're doing the best practice? So I think as we look at the operational maturity of an MSP, first it's like I trust you because your marketing materials are good. and then like you do something bad, and now I kind of don't trust you anymore, and I start to get that learn from experience that not all vendors are equal. So like, what do I do? So do I start asking questions? Do I ask for a certain information? Like, well, how do I start a vendor, I guess, maturity or vendor risk management program?
Yeah. So if I'm an MSP, here's what I would start with. I think too often we try to ramrod one methodology into assessing our vendors, and it doesn't work. So let me give you an example. Let's say you say, I require every one of my vendors to have a SOC 2 type 2. Okay, that sounds great on the face of it, right? Because I have some type of third party attestation, and we can get into the benefits and the lack of benefits of a SOC 2 in a minute if the audience cares. But if you say that as a hardline stance, then the next thing you come against is, well, a SOC 2 type 2 requires at least a full year of data to be assessed, or at least let's call it 6 months. A lot of companies that are brand new, just that's not a thing for them. And so now you're saying I'm going to throw out all innovators and all brand new companies out of the mix because I require SOC 2 type 2. If that's your stance, then power to you, so be it. But you're just going to run into a ton of stuff that you might want to work with and vendors you want to work with that don't have it. And so for me, the way I would sort of approach this is, instead of starting with like hard requirements, I would start with this question. I already hinted at it. Does this vendor store, process, or transmit my customer or sensitive information? If the answer is yes, then I would go down that road to say how much, what kinds, and how does that all involve itself. If the answer is no, then there's very little that I need to deal with. It's a much less important vendor, and I can sort of fast track them through the process of, well, I don't require all that much from them. Like a simple example would be the landscaper, right? If they don't have keys to the building, they just mow the lawn. Well, that's all they do, no big deal. So, hey, this is your price. Cool, I'll pay you by credit card. Cool, we're good to go. That's all it requires. But if it's somebody like my RMM, they store, process, transmit, and have full access to every machine out there. It's basically an exploit kit waiting, ready to go. Well, that would require a lot more. So that's how I would start the process to really guide my thinking and what I would require from there. And then from there, you can build processes around truly assessing what you need to see from that vendor based upon the level of criticality that they present to you as an MSP.
Yeah. So basically, what you're looking at is like which vendors pose the biggest risk to me, right? And
Right.
that's I guess qualitative in a way, right? So you kind of look at it as a way of like gauging, because you don't want to put all your efforts into all vendors all at once, right? Because that's for most MSPs, the amount of resources they have to put into this kind of program is minimal at best sometimes. Um, so right, so we start looking at our vendors, right, and we start to say, all right, these guys pose a bigger risk than most. I start going through the questionnaire and I start to find potential problems, right? Poor update cycles or communication issues, or even I say like I don't even know how to communicate to someone in the event of an issue like a security incident. Like how do I continue that process? So I've identified something. How do I have the conversation with the vendor?
Yeah. So we've seen this come up a number of times in the past where a vendor has some significant vulnerability and they lack a good means and mechanism to communicate to all of their customer base. And so now you have a burning down, red hot, 0 day. We rush to a patch incident, and I'm just making numbers up. 60% of the customer base hasn't patched because they don't know. So where I would really start if I'm an MSP and I say, hey, this is definitely a very critical vendor of ours. One of the things I would want to know is, how am I supposed to hear from you when major events happen? Is it an email that you send? If it is, can we test that email and can we make sure that's fast tracked directly into like inputted tickets and notifications and alerts? Is it some other mechanism? But I would want to know the answer to that, because that is a critical component by which I can't, as an MSP, I can't sit by idly and say, well, unfortunately, we had an incident burned down, not because the vendor didn't know about it, but because they reached out to us and we weren't aware. So that's where I would start, is how do you communicate with us? What is that mechanism and policy? And then let's make sure that we've adapted that process into our own systems so that we know how to react. That's definitely where I would start. And look, even small vendors should have a way to do that. It might be as simple as like, we're just going to send you an email from the founder himself. Okay, great. Let's make sure that that comes in. It's not the NIT spam controls, all that. It could be something far more specific through a trust center. But that's where I would definitely want to start, Roddy.
Yeah. Yeah, the changes, right, based on is this a product that, like, traditionally, or it's like a agent-based or on-prem based versus, like, a SaaS application. So, most nowadays, I would say, most people coming in the space are cloud first or whatever SaaS type applications. How do we have that conversation with someone where we don't have full control, right? Where they're hosting the platform, they're in control of the updates, they're in control of everything except for maybe user permissions or data access or whatever. So, like, how does that change the conversation we have, or does it just reinforce the fact that we need to ask those important questions?
So let's start with this. It might be basic, but we can't ignore it. We have to understand as MSPs, just because we moved to the cloud doesn't mean that we outsourced our security requirements. As evidenced by, go look at Microsoft, go look at ConnectWise, Kaseya, go look at Amazon. All of these larger cloud providers that exist will all have a responsibility matrix of some kind that they've published. And what that matrix will show is, hey, if you shove stuff to our cloud, here are the things that we're responsible for. Here's the things you're responsible for. And what you might be shocked is the vast majority, if not all, of security responsibilities still lies with you. And so this is the first thing we have to recognize. And I think a lot of times our clients just assume because it's in the cloud provider protects it. And that's not the case. And so then the next thing that we say is, okay, well, if the responsibility lies with me, then what documentation do you have for me to be able to meet the order of that responsibility that you have disclosed is mine? And good providers will have that. They'll say to you, here are the things that you need to properly configure. Here are the settings that you need to have. Here are the areas of training that you need to make sure you're communicating. And they'll have those things. So that's really where all of this starts, is understanding the burden doesn't shift, but some of our mechanisms of protecting that data might shift. So, and you might need to start looking at other solutions, right? So maybe a legacy VPN doesn't work and you have to shift towards something like a zero trust network access, ZTNA type of solution, just as an example, to be able to properly protect and cordon off the data and how it's accessed. So that's where I would start. I would go right to the responsibility matrix, understand what is my requirements, and then the next thing I'd ask from that vendor is, well, then how do I accomplish those requirements? And they should have good documentation for you to start working towards that.
Yeah, and going back to a topic you touched on earlier, which is like SOC reports, right? Like, those also contain controls. It's like it's the end user's responsibility.
Right.
And I go back to, like, so I used to work for a CPA firm, and I used to do part of the financial controls, right? And these things called, like, is EUBCs or something, like end user controls, right? It's basically like, we meet this requirement, but only if you perform these actions on your end. So
Right.
there was one bank we did, I'm not gonna name the bank, but this was like 2006, 2005, and they checked off the box on the SOC report. They're like, "Hey, uh, we use standard encryption methods from encrypting traffic going between the browser and our servers, et cetera, but only if you use IE6 or IE7 at the time, and you use this Java plugin that we have." And it's like, "Okay, well, yes, you check the box off, but if I don't use any of the controls, it defaults to the standards, which were not great at the time, right?" So you have to be real careful about requirements, and, like you said, like, what are my responsibilities in this relationship to make sure that we meet all the requirements that you say you have, or that we can do together.
Yeah. Yeah. So to add some extra things into that, is exactly right. I love SOC 2s, right? Like I'm not, a lot of people are just, they automatically default to being like, well, one of two camps. SOC 2s are so great. That's all I need, blah, blah, blah. You got it. I don't even need to read it. I just store it and we're good. And then which is of no value. And then the other people, like, SOC 2s are totally worthless, of no value. I'm like, no, I am actually in the middle. So what I would do is I'd look at a couple things. What you mentioned is dead on. Those are called user control
There
considerations.
you go.
Go to the very back of the SOC 2 and go to the UCCs. I got hammered on that. My first year of doing vendor risk management at the bank, we started reviewing our SOC 2s. We were just coming out of SOC 1s being like the major thing, and SOC 2s had come out. This is like circa 2013 era, probably. And I remember one of my auditors, they said, so give me the list of UCCs and what you've done to assess them. I'm like, I don't know what that means. And I got hammered for that. And I learned that day how important those are, because it's exactly what you said. That's the auditor's way of saying, in order for any of this to be valid, you have to be doing these things on your own. The other thing I would look at in a SOC 2, especially if it's a type 2, which it really needs to be because it's going to cover a period of time, not just like one instant, I would go look for the scope of what's being reviewed. because sometimes in a SOC 2, I remember I had an email security vendor, and the SOC 2 did not cover their email encryption. It only covered some other services that were provided. And I'm looking at this and I'm scratching my head, and I end up reaching out to them. I'm like, hey, this SOC 2 doesn't seem to cover email encryption, which is the number one thing I cared the most about because I did this store, process, transmit risk assessment at the beginning. And I realized, obviously, you guys have encrypted emails. This is a big deal. And got all the way to their chief legal officer. And he said, yeah, well, unfortunately, that's not under scope. So I'm like, so you have nothing for me at all about any attested controls? He said, unfortunately, not. I'm like, wow. So that's the first thing I'd look for is the scope. Make sure the scope covers what that vendor does for you. Second thing I'd look at is what's called the TSPs, the trusted service principles. And that's going to, I'm working off memory here. So it's going to be things like security, privacy, confidentiality. And sometimes you see a SOC 2 that doesn't even cover security. It might just be like availability, and that's it. You're like, well, that's of limited value to me. So those are the big three things I would point to when you're looking at a SOC 2 to really make sure that it is relevant for you.
Yeah, another one too is, if they develop internally their own software, is the testing environment or the coding environment a part of that SOC? Because I mean, if their testing
Yeah.
environment's buggy and you got nation state actors implementing, their own code into or malicious code into it and injecting it into the production environment, like you'll never know the security holes there,
Yep.
right? And we've seen that
We
plenty
have.
of times before to know that it's critical as part of that discussion, as part of that assessment. Um, well, let's talk a little bit more about like the how do we then take all this information, this vendor maturity we're doing, this vendor risk management, how do we turn that into an improved service offering? Is it looking for new vendors? Is it working with our vendors to improve their own security or their own practices? Is it how do you can you market that and being like, hey, we're 100% protecting you from our own threats that we're bringing into your environment, right? Like, how, how do you, and I'm joking, right? Like,
Yeah.
editors don't like cut around this bit, right? Like, I want people to know that like you shouldn't, you are responsible for the risk that you bring into your client's environment. You can't 100% protect them, but how do we use this to our own betterment, I guess?
Well, yeah, you are right. If you use my company, you're 100% secure. You don't have to worry about it, right? Yeah, we've all heard that over and over way too many times from people that are desperate to sell something. So I think this understand as an MSP, you're the great middleman. And what I mean by that is oftentimes you get stuck managing, a suite of tools that the client needs, but you don't own the tool. And you might own the usage of the tool, but that's it, right? And so we've seen things where we have an RMM breach. We've seen things where we have perhaps something like Microsoft based that you're all of a sudden scrambling to go rush and fix. It is a problem not of your own making, but a problem squarely in your wheelhouse to go solve because you deploy the product. Now, it's another discussion for another time around cyber insurance. And does your own tech E&O cover that? Does the client cover that? That's outside the scope of today's conversation, but very closely related. I would just say recognize that your responsibility as an MSP is to be the middle person in this. And that's a very difficult position to be in. And so, what I would do is I would be very clear. I would make sure that I have a very good terms of service and MSA, master service agreement, that I have between myself and my clients that really disclose the areas of my responsibility as an MSP and the areas of their responsibility. But then, and then even protections inside of that should something go awry. But I think you also have to recognize beyond just the legal paperwork that goes through this, you also have to recognize that you're going to put best efforts into, making sure that we're paying attention to vulnerabilities and we have ways for those things to be disclosed to us, that we're taking action upon them as quick as reasonably possible. But understand that this is a huge risk that MSPs shoulder. It's difficult to be an MSP in today's day and age. Roddy, you know this. And so we just have to be aware that these things are going to require us to scramble, which means we need a mature incident response capability. We don't have to have a full-time person dedicated to that, but it needs to be a practice group of people that are ready to go at moment's notice. And resiliency requires you, the last thing I'll say on this, resiliency requires you to say, what are alternative means of production and operation should something go offline, should something be compromised, should something have to be taken down in the middle of some big incident. And I would just say for an MSP, yeah, that's hard work. Yes, you have to do it. But also, those are discussions that you can have with your client that turn into project revenue, that turn into very good discussions around resiliency and keeping their business operational. which is things that business owners care about. So when you learn how to turn this into the requirements of the business, all of a sudden these discussions become very important and tactically and both and revenue from a revenue perspective very valuable to you as an MSP.
Yeah, I like the fact that you touched on like having the conversation with the client, right? Because I remember back whenever we were again going back to my days working at a CPA firm, is like we'd walk into whatever their yearly audit or whatever, and we would do a bunch of hospitals. And one time I was talking with them, and we were trying to. I had assumed in my own head that like patient care systems were probably your most important thing, right? Like X-ray machines and surgical operating rooms and all the other fun stuff. Like those things should be operational. And I remember their IT director going like, "No, it's billing." Because like if our billing system goes down for more than 3 days, like we can't pay vendors because the cash flow inside a hospital is insane. And they're like, if we can't get IV bags or fresh supplies or whatever, like we're hosed. So like the first thing they spin up when there's a disaster is their billing systems. And I was like, that floored me of like, I assume that like your main line of business would be your most important, but we had to put safeguards and that's where we focused our attention as part of that audit was like, how do we make the billing systems more, like you said, resilient, right? Can we have warm sites, hot sites? This was way before, cloud hosting like Azure and AWS was available, but how do we have offsite spin up locations, et cetera, to make sure? And like I think 2 years later, they got hit by a tornado directly to their operations center, and they had their billing systems up and running within like 6 hours.
Wow.
Yeah, and but like that's their without that, the whole rest of the system
Yep.
falls apart. And it goes back to discussions I've had with clients during disasters, right? Security incidents. And they don't think of things like, how do I make sure payroll continues whenever all my systems are down? Because like I got to pay my people, I got to make them happy, right? Like they have bills to pay and families to feed, et cetera, et cetera. And like most people don't ever think about that. They just think about their lines of revenue, right? They need to make sure their engineering software is up, or they need to make sure their case management software is up for their attorney, et cetera. But they don't think about the little small things. So I think
Right.
I think you hit it spot on. Like you can't make those decisions. Like you have to talk to your clients about them as well.
Right.
All right. Well, we're getting close to time here. Last question, and this is one I didn't tell you because I wanted you to panic a little bit. If you had a magic wand or a genie with one wish, and you could fix one thing in the MSP or security space or whatever, what would it be?
A lie detector.
An actual lie
You know,
detector.
yeah, so there's one of we've hinted at some of this that I can have all these wonderful things I hand to the client in my due diligence documentation, and yet, like we said, the back door is just wide open, right? What I really care about more than anything is knowing the company really does care about security. I don't expect perfection. I know perfection's not going to be achievable. What I really want to know is, do you actually care? Or is this just hand waving mechanisms to make sure that you continue to earn a dollar? We've all seen companies on both sides of that fence, both mature, long companies that have been around for a long time, some that truly care, some that don't. And then same with small vendors, some that care, some that don't. So to me, like if I could just wave the lie detector wand to say, do you really care or is this hand waving? Because the one thing we haven't really said at the end of the day, there's still a fair amount of finger to the wind to a lot of assessing, right? Like again, I can look at application security testing if they pass that on to me. I can look at SOC 2s. I can theoretically do some degree of vulnerability management, but there's still just a lot that I don't know behind the scenes. A great example that you mentioned before is actual code auditing and how we push code into production. I'm never going to have visibility from my vendors into that directly. I'm going to have them. I'm going to have things. Well, we say we do this. And the SOC 2 might cover it, but I still don't know for sure. So like I would just love a lie detector wand so I could sniff out the BS and really know whether they care or not. That would be wonderful.
Yeah, I feel you on that one. So to wrap up, thank you again, Wes, for coming on today and sharing your wisdom with us. If anybody needs to get in contact with you, how can they do that?
Yeah, I mean, the two places, empathmsp.com is where I live, and I also live on LinkedIn. So just search me, Wes Spencer, on LinkedIn. I'll come right up and be happy to connect with you.
Awesome, awesome. Again, thank you so much. Appreciate you, um, and appreciate all the work you do and the wisdom you share with everyone. I appreciate your friendship. I guess we're friends. We never really had this discussion.
We
I'm putting
are
you on the
friends,
spot.
Roddy. There's no question.
But again, I do appreciate it, and thanks for making our world a little bit better.
Thanks, Roddy.
Awesome. Have a good one.